Hey, it's Mike here, and today, carnivore dieter Mikhaila Peterson did a TEDx talk, and after realizing what the subject matter and the claims were, TEDx decided to not publish that talk. It's an action their guidelines say is reserved for extreme cases, so we're gonna look into her presentation, what her claims are, and then I'll respond to their decision to not publish it. We're also going to investigate the relatively recent carnivore diet study that she uses at the beginning of her sort of response video to justify the claims and justify why her presentation should not be taken down. We're also going to be looking at the research on meat and arthritis because that was her main issue, as well as some other things. And finally, this video is once again sponsored by Seed Symbiotics, which we'll briefly talk about later on. Firstly, you might be wondering what TEDx is versus TED. TED is the main type of talk, and then they have independently organized events called TEDx. They have their own guidelines, which we'll go into in detail later on, and it's also worth mentioning, in case you didn't know, that Mikhaila Peterson is the daughter of the controversial figure Jordan Peterson. Last I checked, it was like $600 for her diet program, which she says is, pretty much just red meat and salt.
So that's all beef, all lamb, salt, and water.
Sorry, I forgot water. That's almost its own food group. I don't know, does that count? Vegan diets are restrictive though. Anyway, her YouTube channel is fast approaching 500,000 subscribers, so she's grown quite a bit, and her claims for the diet in the beginning of the presentation are,
I'm here to talk about how I put my idiopathic autoimmune disorder and mood disorder and chronic fatigue into remission with an extreme elimination diet of only eating meat.
So you can start to see why TEDx might be a little worried about her claims. That's just the tip of the iceberg, especially when like celebrities are trying the carnivore diet and ending up with scurvy, at least singer James Blunt did. In her video precluding her post of the presentation, she says that there are vegan TEDx talks, and that's just not fair.
They have tons of vegan talks claiming veganism cures diseases. But my story didn't make it through because it violated community guidelines they can't name.
The problem is most of those talks are either loaded with science or are just purely ethical discussion. And even despite Dr. Greger using about 10 studies in this TEDx presentation, they still slapped him with a disclaimer that says, quote, "Please do not look to this talk for medical advice. The speaker makes strong assertions about a specific diet that lacks sufficient scientific evidence for general prescription." Lacks? Is that bad grammar? Anyway, I'm proud to have the top comment with lol to that disclaimer. His upcoming book has 5,000 references. He also just cited more studies than I've ever seen on the TED stage. 3K likes. But the point is, you can't just look at this as like a yin and yang of carnivore and vegan. No, these are largely vegan doctors who are citing the peer-reviewed research versus just some anecdotal claims about carnivore diets. Now, before I get further into her presentation, I have to cover this Harvard study because she mentions it in the beginning, again, as a justification for her entire presentation. So let's just get right to it.
Since then, Harvard has put out a study on the carnivore diet that I've linked below, showing other people who have also had success putting their diseases into remission.
I have to ask, is a study put out by Harvard if there are two pediatrician professors on the docket? It's not like the board of Harvard got together and thought about it and gave the carnivore diet a stamp of approval. No, there's just an affiliation there. I had to mention that, but more importantly to the actual paper, it's essentially a perfect exercise in reporting bias and sampling bias because they just went around to different carnivore social media groups and then asked people to self-report health metrics. I remember Carnivore Figures a few years back saying that they need to put all of these stories into a study so they can prove how healthy a carnivore diet is. They primed their audience with that, and then they go, with that in mind, here is a survey you need to take. They know what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to make the diet look good. And also, even some of this data came from Reddit, which is an anonymous message board. And as some of you may have guessed, the single largest reported source is Sean Baker's Carnivore Facebook group. More on him in a second, but yes, even the carnivore people on Reddit were starting to question this. Like, hey, couldn't people just lie? To which another person responded, stupid people won't take 30 minutes to lie. And all of those self-reported figures were then fed through the additional bias of the researchers, whatever that was, and the conclusion was, quote, "Contrary to common expectations, adults consuming a carnivore diet experienced few adverse effects and instead reported health benefits and high satisfaction. infection. But those Harvard pediatricians didn't want to lose their job, so they even say, quote, "These self-reported data are prone to recall and reporting bias, especially for the pre-diet information. Specifically, participants may have started the diet during a time of poor health and perceived subsequent regression to the mean as a benefit of the diet," I think that was a typo, "and being online community members may have resulted in over-reporting of adherence and perceived beneficial effect." And from the bottom of the study, they thank Sean Baker, yes, again, the same Sean Baker, that called me Little Prick the Vegan and a sack of after I called him out for being delusional about his blood test results, which were horrible. Such caliber of character is guaranteed to garner the most honest responses from their community members. Anyway, moving on. Speaking of blood test results, although you can't take any of this with certainty, they did report a before versus after LDL or bad cholesterol rate of a median of 126 in the beginning, all the way up to 172 in the end. I know it's part of their paradigm to think LDL being high is fine, but high LDL is causal to atherosclerosis, as the European Society of Cardiology mentions here. And just in terms of a chart from this study, we can kind of look at how much atherosclerosis could be expected at different numbers, and their starting point was already on the higher end of the chart, and 172 is just way off the chart, and it's worth mentioning that this is in people with no symptoms of heart disease. So if you add everybody, including people with heart disease, it's gonna look even worse than that. But to close out this study, I know I'm not talking about Mikhaila specifically, but I still think it's important. I have to mention the hierarchy of scientific evidence here, because if you were to classify this, it would be a case series, which is at the bottom of the pyramid of evidence quality, essentially, and contrast that with something like a meta-analysis toward the top. We have multiple meta-analyses showing that, you know, the closest thing to this diet, a low-carb, high-meat diet, increases all-cause mortality by about 30%. And if you add on top that these cases are self-reported, it's essentially anecdote soup that they put into a journal. All right, now let's get to the content of the presentation. She talks about how she was at a young age diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis, which is essentially arthritis as a kid without an obvious cause.
And I was diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, active in 37 joints, and had cortisone injected into 17 of my joints in grade 2.
No, and this does sound like it was super brutal. I'm really sorry that she had to go through this. No child should have to go through this. But one thing I want to make clear is from the research, 17 years later after diagnosis, about half of people with this condition are in remission. This is really important because a sufferer can kind of start going into remission, and then they might attribute that to some lifestyle change or something that's just happening in their life, like rotating the direction of their mattress or something. Anyway, you can keep that in mind, but when she was still young, she went on medication, which put her in remission.
At the same time, my mental health declined dramatically, and I started experiencing OCD symptoms and suicidal thoughts. And I was put on SSRIs and diagnosed with major depressive disorder, potentially bipolar type 2 with hypomania.
And there's a bit of a lack of detail here, but apparently that remission did not last, because by the age of 17, she ended up needing a hip and ankle replacement because her joints were so broken down.
And when I was 17, I had my hip replaced. My body destroyed all the cartilage in my left ankle, and I ended up walking on basically broken bones.
And the timeline is kind of hard to follow, but I think it's around college age she started getting a rash that reached her face, which motivated her to look into diet.
A rash on my face. I cannot handle that, and I started researching.
All right, more interesting points about our presentation in a bit, but first, a quick break with seed synbiotics. Synbiotics is a combination between prebiotics, which feed bacteria, and probiotics, which are just different strains of bacteria. In particular, 53 billion active cell units in there to get the job done, and it is all coated in a well-engineered capsule to survive the onslaught of your digestive system and make it through to where it needs to go. That is where I think other probiotics fail, not this one. It contains 24 strains that have science supporting it in the area of heart health, gut immunity, digestive health, skin function, and so on. They have also kicked it up a notch by adding some whole pomegranate so that it can get some extra antioxidant kick. And finally, as you know, Lindy has been taking these to see if it makes her feel better, and she has now officially said that it is, quote, totally regulated my digestion. Yes, I had had to look down and read that long quote. And yes, I know it's an anecdote, but in this case, backed by science. It's above and beyond what we expected. Anyway, if you are interested, you can click my link in the description below and use the code Mike15 for 15% off your first month's supply at checkout. All right, back to the video. All right, time to take my sweater off to get into the serious stuff in terms of her disease progression and her dietary changes. I'm gonna try and keep all the key points in here. It's kind of hard to do briefly, but here she is.
I started researching and I came across this rash eventually called dermatitis herpetiformis, which is the skin manifestation of celiac disease. So I cut out gluten, I went off of my immune suppressants, which weren't really working anyway, given the fact I'd lost a hip and an ankle.
As usual, the person talking about their health journey didn't mention that they actually got a test. He did not get a gluten test, it doesn't seem like, but started making dietary changes, and it appears that going gluten-free is just a slippery slope to an all-meat diet. But it is worth mentioning with food sensitivities, if you remove what you're sensitive to, you will feel better. And so you could literally go on a dog poop diet, get rid of the harming substance, and do better. Hashtag meat heals, hashtag dog poop heals. But she still had some issues, so she eliminated further and she went down to what was essentially a sweet potato and other root vegetables and greens and meat diet. She says within 3 months, she was cured of her depression.
3 months into that diet, my depression went away for the first time in my entire life.
You know, her rash went away and so on. So if she was making a TED Talk back then, it would be a diet that includes sweet potatoes, cures depression. That was round 1. We'll get to round 2 in a bit. Anyway, she continues.
And I thought, okay, well, I'm not taking any drugs ever again.
Maybe, just maybe, this type of encouraging people to go off depression medication on their own was a little bit of a red flag for TEDx. Just a thought. Anyway, she continues.
I reintroduced soy a couple of weeks after I went off of SSRIs, and I had a full-blown autoimmune response. And it started with my digestion was upset, my entire body got itchy. The next day, my depression was back worse than I'd ever experienced.
You can start to see a little bit of problem with conflating factors here. We have going off SSRIs, we have introducing soy, and you can see how things can become a little muddled in terms of what's causing what. Did she mention getting a soy allergy test? She did not. And it's also feels like she's framing that plants are bad, which is just a paradigm that is required to be on the carnivore diet, that all of these different plants are toxic, but I just have to bring it back down to street level and say that, well, according to this study, legumes are the #1 dietary predictor of elderly survival across global populations, so don't get too deep down the legume hating hole. Now we have to just look into SSRIs for a second. Again, I'm not a medical professional either, but I have to look to maybe something she views as a good source, which is Harvard. And here they say that going off SSRIs can lead to digestive issues like nausea, vomiting, etc., and it can create strange sensations. And just an interesting point from the Arthritis Foundation on pain and SSRIs, they say they work as neuromodulators, turning down the pain signal by modifying the number of chemical messengers like serotonin and norepinephrine transmitted between nerves. So the pain could have come back simply because she went off SSRIs, who knows? And she seems like she's aware that there was a mix of things going on here.
So for the next year, I went in and out of what I now know was SSRI withdrawal mixed with an autoimmune disorder and food sensitivities, and I had 24-day-long reactions each time I tried to reintroduce a food.
But she says she ended up sticking with that diet because she was having reactions every time that she was introducing new foods, and she then got pregnant, which, by the way, is a natural immune suppressant so that you don't attack the baby. She seemed to be doing well enough until about a year later, she ended up getting arthritis again.
I went down to meat and greens to try and get my symptoms under control. And a year after that, I was breastfeeding, getting out of bed, my wrist buckled, the arthritis was back, I was itchy everywhere, and I was like, how is this possible? If I'd experienced remission, why isn't that diet working anymore?
And I once again have to emphasize how little we knew about what was actually going on in her life. I mean, was she eating a lot of spinach? This could have maybe been an oxalate issue if she was really pounding it down. Was she getting sleep? I mean, it seems like this was right after her baby was born. That can obviously have negative effects.
4 weeks after that, so 6 weeks after an all-beef diet, the depression lifted, and I stopped crying in the morning. And 5 months after that, the anxiety lifted, and I was back in what I felt was heaven compared to how I'd been living.
And now we have the second time she has cured her depression, this time after eating an all-meat diet. It is also worth mentioning that in that time period, a baby's sleep schedule might normalize a little bit, just have to throw that in there. I also have to mention that, again, juvenile arthritis naturally goes away by this point about 50% of the time. So it's possible that with hormonal changes and just life happening that it naturally was going away anyway. And I don't want to risk gaslighting here, but I just have to bring up another potential factor here, and that is psychogenic causes. And I'm not just pulling that out of my butt. I mean, from this paper, they say it is very powerful when it comes to arthritis, saying, quote, on average, 75% of pain reduction, 71% of functional improvement, and 83% of stiffness improvement in the treatment of osteoarthritis, at least, are attributable to the placebo/contextual effect. In this context, it could be the suggestibility of dietary purity. More purity equals less symptoms. That can be the belief. It's because biochemically, there's no reason to believe that there is no food out there that she could have added without giving her a 24-hour cycle of symptoms. However, psychologically, that is a lot more likely, unfortunately. But when you're talking about a public talk, we have to think about the implications of other people adopting what the presenter is recommending. And in this case, she said also that she cured her mom's arthritis. So what would happen if everybody with arthritis decides to go on her carnivore diet? Well, first of all, it's worth mentioning that eating meat is on the top of the list that many organizations have in terms of what to avoid dietarily for arthritis. And we can look to, again, the Arthritis Foundation, who says that, yeah, plant-based foods, beneficial, and then warn against animal fats and keto diets in particular. Technically, her diet would fall under keto. But what does the actual literature have to say? Well, from this study, they looked at animal fat, the very thing she is telling you to eat a ton of, in this case, meat and offal, which is an awfully appropriate name for animal entrails. In terms of rheumatoid arthritis, higher consumption 2 years before the arthritis prevalence data was collected was highly associated with rheumatoid arthritis. We're talking a R value of 0.87. An R value of 0.1 is perfect. So this is something you rarely see being that high. And of course, you don't want an earlier onset of arthritis. Well, from this study, they say, quote, compared with low intake red meat rheumatoid arthritis patients, high intake red meat patients had an earlier onset age and a higher BMI. And we're talking about those high meat eaters having about 6.5 years earlier onset of rheumatoid arthritis than the low meat eaters. But to be fair to both sides, this study found that, well, it trended an 8% increase with higher meat consumption. It was not statistically significant, so they say there was no association for that one. And if meat has healing properties for arthritis, they are not showing up in the literature by any means. So best case scenario for her, there's no association. Worst case scenario, she's encouraging people to have a risk of getting arthritis 6.5 years earlier than they otherwise would have. And on the topic of science, at the end of her presentation, she calls for the scientific community to take this seriously and do some case reports.
Be really cool would be if the medical community could take this seriously and do some case studies.
Again, low quality of evidence. And in this area, Mikhaila has a history of being very contradictory. Credit where credit's due. A couple years ago, Vegan Gains made a video exposing this. He mentioned that she had publicly stated that she'd read all the peer-reviewed literature.
I spent the next 4 years reading as many scientific articles as I could get my hands on to try and figure out the underlying cause of my mysterious illnesses. I've read thousands of papers.
And then when he challenged her to a debate, she said that she doesn't care about the science because the medical community had failed her. He also highlights that she claimed to cure her father's mood disorder, but then, as we very publicly know, at the same time on the same diet, he had enough anxiety to have a benzo addiction. Not trying to be insensitive about addictions here, just highlighting the contradiction. There were several other contradictions, but the video is getting a little bit long, so let's just get right to those guidelines. Should TEDx have snubbed her video?
They said my talk went against their community guidelines, but couldn't name exactly what it went against. And it didn't. Like I said, I was really careful. TEDx is supposed to be a place for new ideas and novel thinking and anecdotal reports.
Problem is, due to the guidelines that they clearly sent her, you don't have to break a rule for them to take your video down. They just say, quote, TED reserves the right to remove, reject, annotate, or limit the distribution of any TEDx talk. Again, they say that's in extreme cases, but she seems to think she has a get out of jail free card here because she was only dealing in anecdotes. It doesn't say anywhere that, oh, if you are just making anecdotal claims, you can say whatever you want. Here's my TED Talk on head bonk therapy. There's absolutely no science on it, so you have to publish it, TED. But I think the real crux that people are worried about here is that there's all this censorship going on, but The reality is that they are an independent organization who decides whether or not to platform people's ideas, and it is their ethical duty to think about what the result of those ideas will be. And so they don't have a responsibility to post her video any more than she would have a responsibility to post me talking about something. If she asked me to come on her show, she can say, no, I don't actually want to post that ridiculous thing you said, you crazy vegan. She's still free to go in a public square and say all of this stuff all day. There's no loss of rights here. And furthermore, the goal of TED is to share ideas worth spreading. Again, that is a subjective notion, and they have to draw the line somewhere. If you had a TED talk about how to cook meth, clearly they would not want to have that on there, but you could also argue that it could be good for historical value and even some scientific value. But meth talks is perhaps a little bit too harmful, and this brings me to why I think they took it down, and I think it had to do with the claims that she was making about people who are severely depressed going off their medication on their own accord and curing their depression. That's probably enough there, but then you add on top of that she is doing this through a type of food that is largely scientifically associated with more negative outcomes. We're talking about a class 2A carcinogen. I don't know if she's eating processed meat, class 1A carcinogen here. And then add the environmental effects of what would be a highly destructive diet on top of this. I have a whole video on what the carnivore diet would do environmentally. I'll link that below. On top of that, add the point in their guidelines that they add extra scrutiny to health-related topics, in particular, talks which feature magical solutions or products that claim to solve rather than simply fight against existing problems being a red flag. And you can see how she really doesn't fit the mold for what they want to be posting. And even since the video has like 750,000 views as I last saw, they might just be publicly pressured to post it anyway with a warning label. All of that being said, we also need to remember a group that would be horribly affected by the mass adoption of this diet, and that is animals. We're already killing over 70 billion a year based off the most recent reports, and we don't need to be killing more. In the end, I'm sure people can see isolated benefits on her type of diet because it is dull as hell, as her dad said, enough to get people to be eating less calories, which would lead to weight loss. I mean, drugs lead to weight loss as well. And also that you're just eliminating things that could otherwise harm you. However, you are severely leveraging your long-term health because you are A, probably eating a bunch of potentially carcinogenic meat, and B, ratcheting up your LDL, which is causally linked to atherosclerosis, heart disease, our main killer. You're getting the idea. And also just the arthritis data with meat is showing that the average person is going to be worse off eating more meat. Add on top of that the highest quality evidence for the closest diet to this, a high meat, low carb diet, again and again shows about a 30% increased risk of all-cause mortality, of dying faster. Not good, not a good direction. So for several reasons, this is probably the worst diet on the planet. On that note, if you are interested in seed symbiotics, sorry, little buddy is making little noises over here, babysitting today. If you are interested in seed symbiotics, once again, you can click the link below and use the code Mike15 at checkout. Aren't you just so cute? And feel free to let me know what you think about all this, and like, subscribe, all that good stuff that helps me out, and I'll see you in the next one.